Somewhere west of you, right now, the sun is going down on somebody else's evening. It's the oldest direction there is. Every person who has ever lived has watched the day go that way, over the rooftops, over the water, over the edge of whatever world they knew, and disappear. And for most of human history, people did not say the sun was setting. They said it was leaving, going somewhere, and a surprising number of them agreed, without ever meeting each other, on what else travelled that way. The dead went west. The Egyptians called their dead the Westerners, and buried them on the western bank of the river, where the sun goes down. Remember the direction. Everything tonight moves west. Now, hold that thought, and come with me to a glass case in the British Museum. Inside it there is a sheet of gold. Not a coin, not a ring. A sheet, thinner than paper, about the size of 2 fingers, found in the ground of southern Italy, where a Greek city called Petralia used to stand. It was buried with someone. 23 centuries ago, when that person died, somebody folded this gold leaf and placed it with the body, because written on it, in tiny scratched Greek letters, are instructions. The leaf is about 2,300 years old. But here is the detail almost no one who tells this story mentions. The gold case that holds it in the British Museum today is 400 years younger than the leaf itself. Someone in the Roman period, centuries after the leaf was made and buried, found this ancient instruction manual for the dead, this folded whisper of Greek letters in gold, and made it a case, a little capsule with a chain, to wear against the skin. The instructions outlived their original owner and acquired a second one. Someone who may not have been able to read the archaic Greek scratched inside, or who could read it and wore the words against their throat anyway. The passport for the dead became an amulet for the living. Remember that too. Not prayers, not farewells, instructions, directions for the dead about what to do next. You will find a spring on your left, it says, and standing by it, a white cypress. Do not go near this spring. There is a second spring, it says, cold water flowing from the lake of memory, with guards standing in front of it, and it tells you, word for word, exactly what to say to them. Remember the folded gold leaf. Someone tonight, in another book entirely, is going to describe a spring in the land of the dead. And the two of them have never been explained. Because here is what stopped me when I first read these things side by side. In the same centuries that Greek families were burying their dead with instruction manuals, a Jewish scribe was writing down a journey. In it, a man is carried to the far west of the world, past the mouths of all the rivers, to a great mountain of hard rock. And inside that mountain, his guide shows him 4 enormous hollow spaces, deep and wide and smooth. 3 of them are dark, 1 of them is bright, and in the bright one there is a spring of water. And when the man asks what this place is, the answer is very simple, and it has been sitting in that text for more than 2,000 years. This is where the spirits of the dead are gathered. This is where they wait. There is something peculiar about the word west when you say it at night. East is the direction of beginning, of sunrise, of the new day's first light arriving over whatever horizon holds it. West is the direction of completion, of everything the day was, now releasing. The Latin word for west, occidens, shares its root with the Latin word for to fall, the falling direction, the direction of the last light, and the direction, for most of the people who have ever lived, of what comes after the last light. Not heaven, not hell. Neither had been invented yet. Before humanity agreed on paradise or punishment, someone drew a waiting room and put a spring of water in it. So tonight, we go west with him, slowly, all the way to the mountain. Where do the dead wait, according to the Book of Enoch? Who is in each of the 4 chambers, because the 4 are not the same, and the 4th is the strangest thing in the whole text? Whose voice is the first one heard in those rooms? And why did every civilization around them, Egypt, Babylon, Greece, Judea, quietly agree that the dead do not go far at all? They go somewhere close and specific, and they wait. Before we go further west, let me say this. You don't need to follow every word tonight. This is a slow road west, and you're allowed to drift anywhere along it. Some of it will reach you and some of it won't. That's exactly right. The mountain will still be there when you come back. The spring will still be running in the bright room, and if you fall asleep somewhere in the middle of the journey, that's not a failure at this hour. That's the whole point. This is for the quiet ones. For anyone who has ever watched a sunset and felt, without being able to explain it, that it was going somewhere. For the ones who lie awake at this hour with a kind of wondering about the long dark, about what the old texts knew, about whether the people who mapped the sky and named the stars also understood something about what comes after the last breath. If any of that sounds like you, you're in exactly the right place. Settle in. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let your body be heavier than it was a moment ago. One question before we leave. Where in the world are you tonight? What hour marks your place in the dark? Someone is listening from a city I've never been to, at an hour I couldn't guess. Leave it in the comments. I read them in the mornings, and I like knowing where this reaches. And if this kind of night is what you come here for, a quiet tap on like or a subscribe, that's all I need. The rest of tonight is yours. Let me tell you where the dead lived before anyone drew them a map. The oldest word for death's address in the Hebrew Bible is Sheol. Not heaven, not hell. Sheol, a word scholars have been arguing about for centuries because it resists translation. It is not quite a place and not quite an absence. It is a going down, a descent into something that has no light, no memory of light, no distinction between the person who lived well and the person who didn't. Sheol is the dark that takes everyone, without sorting, without question, without a waiting room. You go in, you stay, that's the whole thing. The kings go down into it alongside the servants, the righteous alongside the people who spent their lives doing harm, the old who had long years, and the children who had almost none. Sheol does not grade on a curve. It has no admissions criteria beyond the single fact of having been alive. The Hebrew Bible is remarkably quiet about what happens inside it. Not because the writers weren't interested, but because what happens there is the absence of everything that makes interest possible. For most of the biblical period, this was the answer. It was the answer anyone could agree on. But it wasn't the only answer anyone was giving. Travel 300 miles east of Jerusalem in the same centuries, and you enter a world that has been thinking about this problem for much longer, and drawing it with much more specificity. Mesopotamia. The world of the two rivers, the world of clay tablets and cuneiform script, the world that gave us the oldest surviving literature on Earth. And inside that literature, inside the oldest story ever written, there is a description of death's address that has the particular quality of a report from someone who has actually been there. A man named Enkidu is dying. He has been the great friend and companion of the hero Gilgamesh, a man of enormous strength who wrestled his way through the world alongside someone who was also, in some sense, beyond it. And in his final days, Enkidu has a dream. The text describes it in careful, deliberate detail, because the writers understood that Enkidu's dream is the closest anyone has ever come to a first-hand account of the address. In the dream, a being takes him by the arm and leads him down, down and down, to a house. And the text description of this house is one of the most striking passages in all of ancient literature. It is a house whose entry has no exit, a road with no return. The people who have entered sit in darkness, dressed like birds, with wings as their covering. On the door and the doorposts, dust. On the table, dust. To eat, clay. To drink, dust. the house where those who enter do not come out, where dust is the food and clay is the bread. Park that image. We're going to walk through Babylon again, properly, in detail, about 40 minutes from now. But hold the house, and the one-way door, and the dust on the table. When we come back to it, something will have changed about the way you hear it. Now go west from Mesopotamia, across the desert, across the Sinai, down into the Nile Valley. Here the dead have a different address, and it is in its own way a more comforting one. The Egyptians called their dead the Westerners, Imtainjwu in ancient Egyptian, not a metaphor, a designation, a category of being. To die was to become a Westerner, to travel in the direction the sun travelled, to cross from the living side of the river to the side where the sun goes down. This is why the great necropolis of ancient Egypt, the cities of the dead at Luxor, at Giza, at Saqqara, all lie on the western bank of the Nile. The river is the boundary. The living live to the east. The dead go west. In the afterlife the Egyptians imagined, the dead arrived at a place called the Field of Reeds, Aru, in ancient Egyptian, which was not very different from the world they had left. There were fields to tend and grain to harvest. The sun rose and set in proper sequence. The dead recognized the landscape because it was a perfected copy of home. The crops never failed, the water never ran low, the work was meaningful rather than exhausting, the afterlife as a better version of everything familiar. But to get there, you had to pass through a weighing. Your heart was placed on a scale against a feather, the feather of Ma'at, the principle of truth and cosmic balance. A being with the head of an ibis recorded the result, and another being, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, waited beside the scale in case the heart proved heavier than truth. It was the most sophisticated moral accounting system in the ancient world, and it asked a question that Sheol never thought to ask: did you deserve it? Now we come to Greece, and to the detail that will matter most later tonight. The Greeks buried their dead with a coin, not always and not everywhere, but the custom was widespread enough that it became proverbial. A single coin, an obol, placed under the tongue, or on the eyes, or folded inside the burial cloth. Payment for Charon, the ferryman who operated the boat at the edge of the world. Without the coin, the dead must wait on the far shore, unable to cross, unable to enter whatever lies beyond, for 100 years. Hold on to the coin. In a little while tonight, people will be burying their dead with a single coin, because the reason is a door with a toll. We'll come back to exactly what that means. And now the book, the reason we're here tonight. The Book of Enoch is one of the strangest survivors in all of ancient literature. It was not written by Enoch, the patriarch who walked with God and was taken without dying, according to the brief and mysterious passage in Genesis, but it claims his voice, his journey, the things he saw. It is not in the Bible that most of the world reads. It exists in the Ethiopian Christian canon, complete and canonical. It exists in fragments, Aramaic fragments recovered from the caves above the Dead Sea, representing perhaps 20% of an original that is mostly still missing, waiting, as we explored together in an earlier night in the dark of the Judean wilderness. Tonight we follow his second journey. Not the journey upward through the heavens, but the journey outward, westward, to the edge of the known world. The text describes it plainly. Enoch is carried west, past the mouths of all the rivers, past the places where water leaves the world and enters the sea, to a great mountain at the far end of everything. And inside that mountain, something is waiting. It is worth dwelling in Sheol for a moment, because its character, or its absence of character, sets up everything that makes 1 Enoch 22 remarkable. Sheol is described in the Psalms as the place where there is no praise of God, not because praise has been replaced by something worse, but because in Sheol there is no speech at all. It is the land of forgetting, the land of silence. The the place where the shadows of what people were move without memory, without relationship, without the very faculties that made them people. Ecclesiastes, which is one of the Hebrew Bible's most relentlessly honest books, puts it plainly: there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol, to which you are going. Not Sheol is a bad place. Not Sheol is punishment. Just Sheol is where the things that define a living person stop, where the computation ends and the stillness begins. The text's tone about it is neither comforting nor terrifying. It is matter-of-fact in the way that a map is matter-of-fact. This is the territory. It has these features. That is all. The contrast with what we're about to find in the mountain is almost architectural. Sheol is formless. It has no rooms, no windows, no internal geography, no features that distinguish one part of it from another. The Book of Enoch's mountain is the opposite in every way. 4 rooms, described with surveyor's precision, with different qualities and different inhabitants, and a spring of running water in one of them. Someone replaced the shapeless dark with a floor plan. Someone said, "Wait, there are distinctions to be made," and then made them. The Mesopotamian world, which was older than the Israelite tradition by at least 1,000 years in its literary output, had been making distinctions about the underworld for a long time. Not always comfortable distinctions. Enkidu's dream does not distinguish between the virtuous and the wicked in any way that offers comfort, but distinctions of rank and kind that suggest an organized place rather than an absolute void. In the older Sumerian literature, the underworld, called the Great Below, or the Land of No Return, was a city, an actual city, with gates and a queen and courtiers and a system of administration. The dead were judged by a council of the Anunnaki, the great gods below, and assigned their fate. The concept of judgment before assignment is older than most people realize. The Sumerians were drawing courtrooms in the afterlife at the same time as Egypt was weighing hearts. The idea that death involves an accounting is not a late invention. It is a very old worry, addressed in very different ways, across the whole ancient world. And then, into this conversation between traditions, into this world where every major civilization had been mapping the address of the dead for centuries, comes the second journey of the Book of Enoch, carrying a traveller to the west, to a mountain, to 4 hollow spaces, deep and wide and smooth, to something that none of the earlier maps had drawn, a waiting room with 4 sections, sorted by the quality of what a person's life had been. The Mesopotamian underworld was also the home of the Anunnaki, the great gods of judgment, those who sat in council below and decided the fate of the dead who arrived before them. If you came to our previous night together on the Anunnaki and the Sumerian records, you will recognize the world, the same tablets, the same cuneiform libraries, the same clay that preserves the oldest human writing. The afterlife they imagined was continuous with the world they imagined. The gods who governed the living from above governed the dead from below, and the council that adjudicated fate had branches in both directions. The specific image of the underworld council, the Anunnaki seated in judgment, reviewing the life that has just ended, is the precursor to Egypt's weighing, to Greece's judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, Aeacus, to 1 Enoch 22's deferred accounting. Across a span of perhaps 2,000 years of written literature, the idea that arriving at death's address involves facing some kind of review is remarkably stable. The details change, the personnel change, the mechanics change, the concept persists. You will be seen, and the seeing will be informed by what you were. The old world agreed on the direction. It disagreed, profoundly, about the address. And then one text, the one we opened tonight, did something that none of the others had done before it. It went there, wrote down the floor plan, and named the first resident. We're going to walk inside it now. The text of 1 Enoch chapter 22 opens without ceremony. Enoch and his guide travel to a mountain. The text calls it a great mountain of hard rock. Not a poetic description, but a physical one. Hard rock, as opposed to limestone, sandstone, the ordinary crumbling material of the ancient Near East. This mountain is something denser, something that will not wear away in the normal span of the world. It is built to last in a very particular sense. It is built to hold something. And inside it, Enoch sees 4 hollow places. Deep, wide, very smooth. The text's choice of these 3 words is careful in a way that rewards slowing down. Deep enough to hold what they need to hold across an indefinite span of time. Wide enough that the inhabitants have room, not cramped, not stacked, but arranged in something that has the proportions of architecture rather than a cave. Smooth as if the rock has been worked by hands, or as if whatever rests here has polished the walls over an unimaginable accumulation of years. 3 of them dark, 1 of them bright. Enoch asks his guide what these hollow places are for. The guide's answer, delivered in the text through an archangel named Raphael, the healer, the one whose name means God heals, is this: these places were made so that the spirits of the dead might be gathered here, all of them, until the great day. Not some of them, not the notable ones, the famous ones, the ones who performed the right rituals or believed the right things. All of them. Every spirit that has departed a human body since human bodies first exhaled, gathered into this mountain at the western edge of the world, held in one of 4 hollow spaces, waiting for something called the Great Day, which the text names but does not describe, does not schedule, does not promise a timeline for. This is the first map of the afterlife in the Jewish tradition that has rooms, actual rooms, sorted spaces with different characters, holding different categories of the dead. Before this text, Sheol was the undifferentiated dark, no rooms, no sorting, no distinction between anyone. This is the moment someone walked through the building with a lantern and said, 4 rooms, here is how they're arranged, here is who goes where, the architecture of death, drawn for the first time in a mountain of hard rock. The bright chamber has a spring in it. The text is specific, a spring of luminous water. Not just water, luminous. Water that carries its own quality of light in the one lit room in the whole building. This is the only comfort installed in the entire waiting place. One spring, in one room, for one category of the dead. Everything else in the mountain is a kind of held breath, neutral, dark, waiting. But the bright room has water that shines. Somewhere tonight, in a glass case in London, a piece of folded gold instructs its reader not to drink from one spring in the land of the dead, and to drink from a second. The instruction presupposes that springs exist there. The Enoch text presupposes the same. The century band in which both were written is not wide. Perhaps 200 years separate the oldest versions of these documents. No one has ever explained why both put water in the same location. Hold that alongside everything else you're holding tonight. The mountain keeps its silence about the coincidence. We have time. Now, there are 4 rooms, but 3 of them work more or less the way you might expect dark rooms to work. The 4th is different. 4 rooms, but only 3 of them work the way you would expect dark rooms to work. Hold the 4th. We are going into it much later tonight, when the hour is quieter and the house has settled. What it contains is unlike anything else in the text, and it needs the right kind of darkness around it when you hear it for the first time. Enoch is moving slowly through these spaces with his guide, trying to understand the scale of what he's seeing, when something stops him. A voice, coming out of one of the dark hollow places, not from the bright one, from the dark ones, a spirit whose voice rises without stopping. The text is specific about its quality, pleading, accusing, complaining, not settled, not at rest, not the silence of Sheol, active and insistent and directed upward, towards something the spirit cannot see from inside the dark room. And Enoch, standing in the mountain with his guide, asks, "Whose spirit is this? Whose voice rises like that?" The guide answers with a sentence that has been sitting in this text for more than 2,000 years. "This is the spirit of Abel, the son who was slain by his brother Cain, and his spirit makes petition, lodges its complaint, presses its accusation, until his brother's offspring are destroyed from the face of the earth, until the seed of Cain is eliminated from the human line." Let that settle. The first human being ever to die is the first resident of the waiting rooms, the very oldest case in the ledger of human violence, the first time a human hand was raised against another human life, is still open, still active, still rising out of the dark. Abel's complaint has been on file since before any written record existed to receive it, and it is there in the mountain at the edge of the world, still being pressed, still waiting for the resolution that has not come. The text does not tell us whether this is justice on its way or justice indefinitely postponed. It simply reports what Enoch heard, and Enoch, who is in the habit of being shown difficult things without being given easy comfort about them, moves on. His case is still open. Remember the ledger. We'll come back to it later when we stand in the third chamber and understand what kind of room it is. There is something in the structural decision that deserves attention before we leave this segment. The writers of this text could have put any voice in the dark chambers, could have put a king there, a prophet, a great sinner, anyone whose story a reader would recognize. They put Abel, the first victim, the original unanswered cry. The mountain begins not with power but with complaint, not with a throne but with a ledger. And the first entry in that ledger is a name that has been known since the beginning of human storytelling. Every afterlife tradition has to solve a justice problem. If the good and the wicked both go to the same dark, something has gone wrong with the accounting. Sheol had no answer to this. Egypt's answer was the weighing, the feather, the heart, the judgment before you got anywhere. Mesopotamia's answer was mostly silence. The house of dust takes everyone, and the king and the slave eat the same clay. But 1 Enoch 22 proposes a different answer. Not immediate judgment, not instant sorting into reward and punishment. Something more patient, a waiting room, with 4 sections, sorted by category, but the accounting deferred, the books held open, the cases on file, the spirits kept, with care and without cruelty, until the day that the text calls great arrives and the accounting is completed. The journey to the mountain in the text is worth describing before we arrive there, because the journey is itself meaningful. Enoch is carried. The text does not say he walks, does not say he travels in any ordinary sense. He is carried by the 2 archangels who accompany him on this second journey, westward, past the mouths of the rivers. The mouths of the rivers. This is a specific image with a specific ancient geography. In the cosmological imagination of the ancient Near East, the rivers of the world had their sources somewhere in the interior of the land, and their mouths where they emptied into the great encircling sea. The Nile, the Euphrates, the Tigris, the other rivers the world knew about, they all travelled from east to west, or from interior to coast, and they arrived eventually at a boundary. Past that boundary was the ocean. Past the ocean was the edge of the known world. And past that, in the tradition of the Book of Enoch, in the imagination of a people who were mapping the entire cosmos, was the mountain. The journey has the quality of a dream of travelling very far, very smoothly, without the ordinary resistance of distance. The landscape passes beneath you. The rivers widen and then end. The ocean spreads out, and then that too is behind you, and then the mountain, and then the hollow places inside it. What Enoch is seeing, what the text is describing, is not simply a local geography. It is a cosmological claim that the afterlife has an address, and the address is at the western edge of the world, and the western edge of the world is real, and someone has gone there and come back with a floor plan. The specificity is the point. The text is not saying somewhere in the west. It is saying past the mouths of all the rivers. It is giving Enoch a journey with landmarks, a journey that a careful reader might, in principle, follow. The dead, on this understanding, have not simply ceased to be. They have gone somewhere, a specific somewhere, with dimensions, with a spring of water in one of its rooms. Let me give you the text description of the mountain itself, slowly, because it deserves the attention the writer gave it. The text says, "I saw a great and high mountain of hard rock." It says, "There were 4 beautiful places inside it." It says they were deep and wide and very smooth. And it says, 3 were dark and 1 was full of light, with a spring of water in it. That word smooth is worth staying with. The other 3 words, deep, wide, dark, are what you might expect from hollow places in a mountain, the natural vocabulary of describing caves. But smooth? Smooth suggests that something has happened to the rock's surface. Either it was worked by hands, carved, polished, shaped deliberately into the form it now holds, or it has been inhabited long enough, patiently enough, that the mere presence of whatever is inside has worn the roughness down. Either way, smooth is not the word of a natural cave. It is the word of a prepared space, a made thing, or a thing that has been lived in long enough to take on the quality of a made thing. The 4 hollow places. The text does not number them first. It gives you the quality before the count. Deep, wide, very smooth. 3 dark, 1 bright. And only then, when you have the sensory description, do you learn that the guide has an explanation for all of this. These were made. The guide uses the passive, which is the mode of things whose maker is understood without being named. These were made so that the spirits of the dead might be gathered here, until the great day of their judgment. Until. That word is the hinge of the entire chapter. The gathering is temporary. The being here is temporary. Everything in the mountain is in a condition of waiting, not of arrival, not of final placement, but of being held. Between the last breath and something the text calls the great day, there is this, the mountain, the hollow places, the spring, the waiting room. And now the word deep in the description takes on a different quality, not just physically deep, though the physical depth is part of it. Deep in the way that time is deep, deep enough to hold everyone who has ever died, from the first death to the last one. Deep enough that the spring in the bright room has been running since the beginning, and will run until the end. Deep enough for Abel. Enoch is moving carefully now, because the guide is showing him something that has not been shown to a living person before. Not in this tradition, not in this form. He has seen the storehouses of weather in the upper heavens on his first journey. He has seen the places where light and darkness are kept, where the stars are managed. But this is different. The storehouses of weather are about the administration of the physical world. The mountain is about the administration of every person who has ever lived. There is a spring. In the bright room, there is a spring of luminous water. The word luminous is specific. It is not borrowed from the bright room's light, not merely reflective. The spring generates its own light in the way that living things generate their own warmth. It is alive in a sense that the 3 dark chambers are not. And it runs, continuously, without needing to be filled from outside, without draining, in the one chamber where the text imagines something like rest. It is the most bureaucratic vision of the afterlife in ancient literature. It is also, in its own way, the most just, because it refuses to close the books before the whole story is known. A sorted afterlife, with a spring, and a complaints department, which raises the question that this entire night turns on. Where did this map come from? Because nothing before it in the Jewish tradition looks anything like this, and almost everything that comes after it does. There are three ways to read what we've just seen in the mountain. Three honest lenses, each of which reveals something different, and none of which cancel the others. The first is what scholars call the development lens. If you trace the history of the afterlife in Jewish tradition, not as a matter of faith, but as a matter of intellectual history, the way you might trace the development of astronomy or medicine, you find a remarkable gap. On one side of the gap is Sheol, the old, dark, undifferentiated holding place that the Hebrew Bible mostly takes for granted and rarely describes. On the other side of the gap is what eventually becomes the full doctrine of heaven and hell, paradise for the righteous, a place of consequence for the wicked, the architecture that most of the Western world inherited and that still shapes how most people think about death, even people who have given up on every other piece of traditional religion. Those two things are very different. They do not naturally produce each other. Sheol does not, by any obvious internal logic, become heaven and hell. Something happened in the middle. Something changed the model. What scholars like George Nicholsburg, who has spent much of his career on 1 Enoch and is one of the most careful readers the text has, have argued is that 1 Enoch 22 is the something that happened in the middle. It is, as far as anyone has been able to determine, the earliest surviving Jewish text to draw rooms in the afterlife. Not one undifferentiated dark, but sorted spaces. The righteous here, the wicked there, the victims in their own chamber, the complicated cases in theirs. The text sits precisely at the fold between the old model and the new one. It is the hinge. And what it offers, in place of immediate judgment or continued undifferentiation, is something subtler, a waiting period, held spaces, the books open and not yet closed, the accounting deferred but not abandoned. If you were trying to understand how Sheol became heaven and hell, this text is the room where the renovation happened. The walls went up, the lights came on in one of them, and for one brief period, perhaps a century or two, the building had 4 rooms and a spring of water and a complaint still on file from Abel, before the tradition simplified it into the binary that most of us know. That simplification came eventually, but before it did, someone drew something more complicated, and it's in a text that most people who care about this have never read. The second lens is what you might call the contact lens, and it raises a question that is genuinely, professionally, still open. The mountain in the west, the spring in the bright chamber, the instruction not to drink from the wrong spring, the guards at the spring of memory, 2 texts from overlapping centuries in neighboring cultural worlds, one Jewish, one Greek, both putting water in the same location in the land of the dead. The question scholars ask about this kind of pattern is contact or parallel. Did these ideas travel along trade routes through the Hellenistic cultural exchange that was reshaping the whole Eastern Mediterranean in exactly this period? Or did they develop independently because the human mind, confronted with death, keeps arriving at the same images? The honest answer is, we don't know. The scholarly debate is alive. The evidence for cultural contact between Jewish and Greek intellectual worlds in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era is strong. It was the period of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, done in Alexandria, at the intersection of both worlds. Ideas travelled. Texts travelled. Whether the specific imagery of springs in the land of the dead travelled with them, or whether 2 traditions independently arrived at the same image because water is life and its presence in death's address is a universal consolation, that question is still being worked out in the footnotes of dissertations. What can be said is this: the resemblance is real. The scholarly question is open. and the fact that it is open is more interesting than any forced answer in either direction. The third lens is the one I want to offer as a question and hold there, without pressing for an answer. Why do human beings everywhere and repeatedly draw the same building? Not the same theology, not the same ritual, not the same scripture or tradition or authority. The building, the waiting room, the holding place, the sorted space between the last breath and whatever comes next. Babylon drew it. Egypt drew it. Greece drew it. Judea drew it. And in the centuries and millennia that followed, Islam drew it. Hinduism drew it. Buddhism drew it. And the traditions that scholars call indigenous or shamanic drew versions of it without having read any of the others. None of this is offered as a report of what awaits anyone. That is not what this video is, and it's not what I'm in any position to offer. What the evidence actually shows is stranger and more human than any claim about what lies beyond the last breath. For at least 4,000 years, we have refused to leave the dead unsorted. We have drawn rooms for them. We have imagined springs in the bright ones. We have put their complaints in writing and kept the books open and told each other, in 100 languages and 100 forms, that the dead are somewhere close and that the accounting is still in progress. The development lens requires a careful walk through what actually changed. In the Hebrew Bible's oldest layers, the dead and the living are in relationship. But the relationship is managed with care, because the line between caring for the dead and manipulating them through forbidden practices is one that the tradition polices anxiously. The dead can be consulted, as when Saul consulted the woman of Endor, who called up the shade of Samuel, and the text's clear discomfort with this practice tells you that the practice existed and that it was taken seriously, even by the people the tradition disapproved of. The dead are somewhere. They can be reached. But the reaching is not supposed to be done. This is not quite Sheol as total silence. This is a tradition aware that the dead have some kind of presence, some residue of being that continues after the body stops, and unsure what to do with that awareness. It is held, awkwardly, alongside the formal teaching that Sheol takes everyone. The Book of Enoch, and specifically 1 Enoch 22, intervenes in this awkwardness with an architectural solution. It does not simply say the dead are somewhere. It says they are sorted and held, and that the sorting is based on the character of what their lives were, not on the ritual correctness of their burial, not on the family's ability to perform the proper rites, not on anything external to the person themselves. The sorting is moral. The rooms are not assigned by accident or by luck. The righteous go to the bright room with the spring. The wicked go to the dark chambers with their different qualities of waiting. The wronged have their own room where their complaint is preserved. The complicated ones are simply held. This is a massive conceptual change from Sheol, and it happened, scholars believe, in a relatively short period, driven by specific historical pressures. The pressure was this: the people who wrote and read the Book of Enoch in the 2nd century before the Common Era were living through a catastrophic set of experiences. The Maccabean crisis, when the Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV Epiphanes desecrated the temple, outlawed Jewish religious practice, and executed those who refused to comply, was not ancient history to them. It was recent. Some of them had lost family members who died for their faith. Some of them were the children or grandchildren of people who had been killed for observing Shabbat or refusing to eat pork. And the old answer, Sheol takes everyone, the righteous and the wicked alike, into one dark, and that's the end of the accounting, was not adequate to that experience. It could not be adequate, a system in which the person who died for refusing to desecrate their faith and the person who desecrated it share the same dark and the same silence and the same nothing, is a system that says the distinction between those choices does not matter, and the tradition was not willing to say that. So it drew rooms, not as a comfortable metaphor, not as a speculative exercise, but as a theological necessity, an insistence that the distinction matters, that the books are not closed, that the wronged do not simply dissolve into the undifferentiated dark alongside the people who wronged them. The sorting is the refusal to accept that death undoes the difference between justice and injustice. This is why Abel is in the bright chamber's dark neighbour, pressing his complaint, not as a colourful detail, as a structural claim. The first unjust death is still on file. The filing system did not exist before, because Sheol had no filing system. 1 Enoch 22 installed one. And it left the oldest case in human history open inside it, because the text understood that a system that closes Abel's case without a full accounting is not a justice system at all. The contact lens asks a different question, not what the tradition needed, but what it received from outside. The world in which 1 Enoch 22 was written was the Hellenistic world. Alexander the Great had swept through the eastern Mediterranean less than 2 centuries earlier, and in his wake came a cultural mixing that had no precedent in the ancient world. Greek language and Greek ideas moved into Egypt, into Judea, into Mesopotamia. The Septuagint was produced in Alexandria in this period, Jewish scholars translating the Hebrew scriptures into Greek for a Greek-speaking Jewish diaspora. The exchange ran in both directions, Greek ideas reaching east, Eastern ideas reaching west. And one of the Greek ideas that was particularly active in this period was the Orphic tradition, the set of beliefs about the soul's journey, the springs in the underworld, the instructions that could be provided to the dead to help them navigate the transit. The Orphic lamellae, the gold tablets buried with their dead, including the Petilia leaf, are products of this tradition, and they are exactly contemporary with the composition of 1 Enoch 22. Did the idea of springs in the afterlife travel from Greece to Judea, or from Judea to Greece, or was it arrived at independently by both? The honest answer, and I want to keep giving you honest answers tonight, is that scholars do not know. The evidence for direct influence is suggestive but not conclusive. The evidence for parallel development from a shared human intuition, that water is life, and that the presence of water in death's address is a consolation that the mind reaches for without being told to, is equally suggestive. These things happen in the history of ideas, 2 traditions, in contact with each other's wider world, solving the same problem with the same image, without one necessarily teaching the other. What the contact lens tells us, whether it finds direct influence or parallel development, is something about the quality of the century in which both traditions were active. It was a century that was thinking hard about the dead, that was folding gold instructions into graves and writing apocalyptic tours of the afterlife, and arguing about what the books would show when the accounting was complete. That was, in short, a century doing exactly what we are doing tonight, trying, with the tools available to it, to draw the floor plan of where the dead wait. That fact, whatever it means, is not nothing. Now let's walk the other waiting rooms, the ones the neighbours drew, and see how close the floor plans really are. We go down the oldest stairs first. The oldest stairs go down into Babylon. Not the Babylon of the Bible, the one that conquered and deported and became a symbol. The older Babylon, the Babylon of the great literary tradition, the one that stretches back before the Hebrews and the Greeks and the Persians, to a civilization that was already ancient when Greece was still learning its alphabet. This is the Babylon that gave us the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving work of literature in human history, written on clay tablets that scholars still disagree about, still translate, still argue over in footnotes. We touched the epic earlier tonight, Enkidu's dream, the house whence none who enter come forth. But there is more to walk through, and the second half of Babylon's afterlife tradition is stranger than the first. Go back to the dream. Enkidu is taken by the arm and led down. Down past the house of dust, down past the doorposts with their dust and their darkness. And inside, what does he see? The great ones who once ruled the world, the kings and the high priests, reduced to the same condition as everyone else. The crown is off. The throne is empty. No one is served here. No one is waited on. The cook in the underworld serves clay. The manager of the dead distributes dirt. The first thing Gilgamesh's epic wants you to understand about the underworld is that rank does not survive the transit. Whatever made you important above, it does not pass through the door. You are precisely as significant as Enkidu, who was a wild man shaped from clay, and precisely as significant as the greatest king who ever lived. The house of dust is the great equalizer, not the bright kind of equality, but the empty kind. And then the tradition adds Inanna. Inanna is the queen of heaven, the goddess of love and war, and the morning star, one of the most powerful and complex figures in the Mesopotamian pantheon. And in one of the most remarkable poems of the ancient world, she decides to descend to the land of no return, not to visit, not to rescue anyone. The poem's motivation is slightly obscure, as motivation in ancient literature often is. Scholars have proposed that she went to claim power over the underworld, or to attend the funeral of her sister's husband, or simply because the poem's logic required her to go. The descent happens in 7 stages, 7 gates, going down, and at each gate, a demand, something must be surrendered. At the first gate, the crown, at the second, the earrings, at the third, the beads, at the fourth, the ornaments, at the fifth, the ring, at the sixth, the pectoral, at the seventh, the royal robe. By the time Inanna reaches the throne room of the underworld, where her sister rules with all the cruelty of a queen who has been below too long, she has nothing. She is stripped of everything that made her what she was above, and her sister turns the eye of death on her, and she becomes a corpse. There is more to the poem. Rescue arrives, complications mount, the descent reverses. But what the first movement of Inanna's story shows is something specific about how Babylon understood the boundary. The boundary strips you, whatever you accumulated in the world above, power, beauty, rank, adornment, the external markers of what and who you were, none of it passes through. Every gate takes something. By the time you arrive, you are only what cannot be removed. The question the poem doesn't fully answer, and perhaps doesn't try to, is, what is that? What remains when everything removable has been removed? The dust in the house of no return eats. The clay in the house of no return drinks. Whatever the inhabitants of that place are, they are still something, still there, still waiting, still present in a mode the poem's language can point at, but not define. Hold the 7 gates. The next tradition will recognize them. Wave 2 goes west. The Egypt of the dead is not a place of punishment. That is the first thing to understand about it, and it is worth spending time on because it is so different from the tradition most of us have inherited. Egyptian religious thought does not begin with sin. It begins with order, ma'at, the principle of right relationship between all things. And its afterlife is not about reward and punishment in the way we might think. It is about the restoration of order, about going home. The ferry across the Nile. This is the first movement in the Egyptian journey of the dead, and it has the quality of something so ancient it has become instinct. The river as the boundary between 2 kinds of life. You have lived on the eastern bank, where the sun rises, where the crops grow, where the day begins. And now you cross to the western bank, where the sun sets, where the rock tombs are cut, where the dead go. The ferry operates. The river holds still long enough for the crossing. And then the weighing. The image is one of the most recognizable in all of ancient art. The great scales. The heart on one side, the feather on the other. The feather of Ma'at is the lightest possible standard. Truth, in its most essential form, weighs nothing. And your heart, which has been the seat of your conscience and your will across a whole human life, is measured against it. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing and wisdom, records the result. And nearby, a creature called the Devourer, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, waits to consume the heart that proves too heavy. This is the only real danger in the Egyptian afterlife. Not eternal punishment, but non-continuation. A heart that cannot pass the weighing is eaten, and the person who owned it ceases to exist. The Egyptian fear of death was not hell, it was oblivion, the second death, the erasure of the name. If you passed, and the text suggests that the weighing was meant to be passed, that the rituals and spells and the guidance of the Book of the Dead were intended to prepare the heart for its moment rather than to expose it, then you arrived in the field of reeds. The field of reeds is the afterlife Egypt imagined as worth having. It is Egypt perfected. The Nile flows there. The crops grow without blight. The family is reunited. The work is meaningful. The sun rises properly. The dead who arrive there are not diminished versions of themselves. They are more fully themselves than the living had time to be, freed from the constraints that mortality imposed. The dead live on the west bank. The living go to visit, leave offerings, tend the tombs. The relationship between the living and the dead in ancient Egypt is not separation but a different kind of adjacency. They are neighbors now, across the river, and the proper care of the neighborhood is a responsibility that the living takes seriously because they expect to join it. If you're still awake at this point in the night, and wherever you are right now, in whatever time zone and whatever kind of dark, I want to ask you something. What's the most peaceful place you've ever watched the sun go down? Not the most spectacular, the most peaceful. Tell me below, if you're still here. Someone in 100 different places is listening right now, and I'd like to know where the sunsets are most quiet tonight. Wave 3 goes to Greece, and this is the wave we've been building toward. The Greek underworld is a geography, not a philosophy, not a symbol, not a spiritual metaphor. A place with specific topography, specific roads, specific features that you would recognize if you arrived there because they have been described to you in advance. The entrance to the underworld is in the west. Of course it is. Tonight, everything moves in the same direction. You travel past the setting sun, past the edge of the world, past the place where the ocean folds under itself. And at the boundary, you find the river. Charon operates a boat on this river. He is old and not interested in conversation, and he charges a fee. 1 coin. An obol, a small Greek coin, low denomination, the kind you might have several of in a pouch, but you need to have it. Without the coin, Charon does not take you across. Without the crossing, you are left on the near bank, the wrong side, and you wait. The text says 100 years. Other versions say forever. This is why Greek families buried their dead with a coin, not as jewelry, not as wealth to carry into the next life, as a toll, a practical payment for a practical need. The dead required exact change for the ferry. The living made sure they had it. Hold the coin in your mind, the coin you've been holding since the credibility segment, since I told you people would start burying their dead with a single coin, and that the reason was a door. The door is the ferry, the toll is the obol, the ferry is the crossing. And on the other side of the crossing is the underworld with its sorted territories. Elysium for the great, Tartarus for the punished, and the asphodel meadows for the ordinary majority, who were neither exceptionally good nor exceptionally wicked, who simply lived and died without achieving anything the tradition thought worth rewarding or punishing. The asphodel meadows, the name alone is almost a lullaby, grey fields of flowers. Asphodel is a Mediterranean wildflower, pale and modest. where the majority of the dead wander without strong memory, without strong feeling, without strong anything. Not suffering, not particularly content, simply present, in the way that the dead are present in a tradition that believes in their presence. And now the gold leaf, the one in the glass case, the one I asked you to hold at the beginning of tonight. There are about 40 of them. Scholars call them the Orphic gold tablets, or the Orphic lamellae, lamellae meaning thin sheets, and they have been found from Crete to southern Italy, from the 4th century before the Common Era through the Roman period. They were made in varying sizes, written in varying hands, buried with varying people, but they share a remarkable consistency of instruction. They are passports for the dead, maps with passwords. The Petilia tablet is one of the earliest and most complete. It was found near the ancient Greek city of Pettalia in what is now Calabria, in the toe of Italy, in the 1830s. It is approximately 4.5 centimeters long, about the size of 2 fingers held together, made of gold leaf thin enough to fold without cracking. It has been in the British Museum since 1843. Here is what it says. Slowly, because the instructions deserve the attention they were written with. You will find on the left of the house of Hades a spring, and standing by it a white cypress. Do not go near this spring at all, but you will find another spring, to the right, where cold water flows from the lake of memory, and there are guardians in front of it. Say, I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is of heaven, and this you know yourselves. And lo, I am parched with thirst, and I perish. Give me quickly the cold water flowing forth from the lake of memory, and of themselves they will give you to drink from the holy spring. 2 springs, one on the left, by a white cypress, do not drink. One on the right, the lake of memory, with guardians, give the password. I am a child of earth and starry heaven. My race is of heaven. And in 1 Enoch 22, the bright chamber in the mountain at the western edge of the world, with its spring of luminous water, in the one lit room among the 4. 2 springs, 2 traditions, 1 century band. Scholars have proposed various explanations. Orphic influence on early Jewish thought, shared Hellenistic cultural background, independent development from the same human need to put water in the land of the dead, because water is life, and its presence is comfort wherever you are. No single explanation has convinced everyone. The debate continues in the quiet scholarship that most people never hear about. What can be said without overstepping? The resemblance is there. The water is there. The instructions are there. And for those who are listening tonight, in the dark, with the question still open, you are holding the question in the same hand as the scholars who have held it for a century. Wave 4 brings us back to Judea. The ideas in 1 Enoch 22 did not stay in 1 Enoch 22. In the centuries after the text was written, the tradition kept thinking, kept developing, kept building on the map that had been drawn. The 4 rooms simplified, the categories compressed, the waiting period shortened, the accounting sharpened. What had been 4 nuanced chambers began to resolve into the binary that most of us have inherited: comfort for the righteous, consequence for the wicked. And somewhere in this process, somewhere in the 1st century of the Common Era, in the Galilee where the most famous rabbi of that tradition was teaching, a parable was told that many scholars read as a direct engagement with the map we've been following tonight. Luke 16, verse 19. There was a rich man, it begins, no name given, clothed in purple and fine linen, who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Both men die. And here is where the parable does something that the Hebrew Bible almost never does. It describes what happens immediately after. Lazarus is carried by angels to the bosom of Abraham. The phrase is particular, specific, warm. Not heaven in the later sense, not paradise. The bosom of Abraham, proximity to the patriarch, in comfort, held close. The rich man dies and is buried, and finds himself in the place of the dead. In torment, it says, and he lifts his eyes and sees Abraham far away, with Lazarus beside him. He calls out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame." And Abraham answers, "Between us and you a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us." A great chasm, a fixed separation, two regions visible to each other but unable to communicate, except that they do, in this parable, across the chasm for a few exchanges. The scholar George Nicholsburg, in his commentary on 1 Enoch, notes that the parable of the rich man and Lazarus maps onto 1 Enoch 22's chamber geography with a specificity that is difficult to call coincidence. The bright chamber and the dark chambers, separated by their different characters, the ability to see across the separation, the categories of the dead sorted by how they lived, the waiting before the final accounting. Let me slow down the Babylon section, because Enkidu's dream deserves the time we have for it at 55 minutes. Enkidu has been the great companion of Gilgamesh, the wild man shaped from clay, the one who tamed lions with his bare arms, the one who became the mirror of the king, and their friendship is one of the oldest and most moving in all of literature. They have done impossible things together. They have defeated a monster in a cedar forest. They have killed the bull of heaven. They have walked places that the gods warned them not to walk. And then Enkidu falls ill. The punishment for their hubris, the gods decide, will fall on him rather than on Gilgamesh. And in the night before his death, he dreams. In the dream, a being, part eagle, part man, with the face of darkness, takes him by the arm, and Enkidu cannot resist, because in the dream his strength is not available to him. He is carried downward, down and down, to the house. The text says, "The house of darkness, the place from which those who enter do not return. The road of no going back," it says, "those who dwell there are deprived of light." And then, in what is one of the most precise and surprising lines in the entire epic, it says, "They eat clay, and their food is dust, and they are clothed like birds, with feathers as their garments." Clay, dust, feathers instead of clothes. The word for feathers here is related to the word for wings. So what Enkidu sees is the dead in winged garments, as if death makes everyone something like a bird, something half prepared to fly, but pointed in the wrong direction. There is something deeply specific about the detail of clay as food. Not nothing, clay. Clay is what the earth is made of. Clay is what the earliest Mesopotamian creation stories say human beings are made from. The gods formed humanity from clay, and to clay the dead return. The image is of the dead consuming what they are made of, in a dark house, dressed in the material of flight but unable to fly. It is the image of a thing in suspension, neither the activity of life nor the nothingness of total obliteration, but a held condition of reduced being. Enkidu wakes from this dream terrified, and the text allows him to be terrified. It does not offer comfort. Gilgamesh, beside him, does not have comforting words. He has grief, enormous grief, but not comfort. The epic is honest about the limit of what a friend can give you when the friend cannot follow you to where you're going. This is why the Epic of Gilgamesh is not a story about the problem of death being solved. It is a story about the problem of death being faced. Gilgamesh, after losing Enkidu, goes on a quest for immortality, finds the plant that grants it at the bottom of the sea, and has it taken from him by a snake while he's sleeping. He returns to his city empty-handed. The walls he built are still standing. The friends he had are not. The epic ends not with triumph but with the city. The walls, the work, the things that outlast a life. And Enkidu's dream remains the most precise description of death's address that the ancient world's oldest literature offers. Clay for food, dust for drink, the feathered garments, the one-way door. This is where the dead of Gilgamesh's tradition live, and they have been living there, in this description, for 4,000 years. Inanna's descent through the 7 gates is a different kind of journey. Where Enkidu is taken against his will, Inanna descends by choice, or at least by intention, even if the intention is obscure. And the 7 gates are not just a narrative device for generating suspense. They are a theological claim about what the boundary costs. At each gate, something is taken. The crown, the symbol of her heavenly authority. The earrings, her personal adornment, her beauty in the abstract. The beads from her neck, the lapis lazuli necklace that marks her as the Queen of Heaven. The breastplate that covers her heart. The gold ring from her finger. The lapis lazuli rod and line. The tools of her measurement and power. And finally, at the 7th gate, the royal robe itself. Stripped of everything that marked her as what she was above, Inanna arrives naked before her sister, who is the ruler of the land below. And her sister turns the eye of death on her. What the 7 gates are stripping away is not punishing her. The underworld does not strip her because she deserves to be punished. It strips her because the underworld requires everyone to be the same. The boundary insists on equivalence. Whatever you were above, whatever made you distinctive or powerful or recognizable as a specific person in a specific role, none of it passes through. You arrive as the irreducible thing you are, without the decorations. This is the same claim that the House of Dust makes in Enkidu's dream. The kings and the priests in the dark house are no longer kings and priests. They are inhabitants of the dark, equal in their reduced condition to everyone else. The underworld is not interested in rank. It is interested, if it is interested in anything, in the thing beneath rank, which the traditions have very different ideas about, and which 1 Enoch 22 addresses differently than either Babylon does. The Egyptian tradition walks us into brighter territory, and I want to do it justice because it is sometimes caricatured, reduced to the mummies and the curses and the dramatic iconography, in a way that misses its genuine philosophical depth. The Egyptian dead are not simply preserved, they are transformed. The embalming process was not only about keeping the body, it was about preparing it for a different kind of existence. The canopic jars that held the organs were kept nearby because the body would need everything to function in the next life. The spells in the Book of the Dead were not insurance against bad luck. They were practical guidance, the result of a tradition that had been refining its understanding of the transit for millennia. And the field of reeds, the destination, is worth taking seriously as a piece of cosmological imagination. It is not cloud and harps. It is not an abstraction. It is Egypt, better Egypt. Egypt where the Nile always rises to the right level. Egypt where the barley always comes in at the proper height. Egypt where you recognize the landscape and the work and the relationships because they are the ones you knew, perfected. This is a profound insight about what human beings actually want from an afterlife, which is rarely the abstraction of heaven, but usually the continuation of the particular things that made the particular life worth having. The Egyptians did not imagine their dead wanting something entirely different from what they had. They imagined them wanting what they had, completed. The dead cook. The dead tend their gardens. The dead sit with their families in the evening light and watch the Nile go by. The dead have, in other words, a home, and the home is on the other side of the river, close enough to visit, far enough to be distinct. The comment ritual happened a few minutes ago, and I want to come back to the point about the springs before we move to Greece. Water in the land of the dead is not an obvious detail. You might expect the dead to be past hunger and thirst, past the needs that bodies have, since they no longer have bodies in any form the living world would recognize. And yet, every tradition we've visited tonight includes water. Enkidu's dream has the dust and clay that substitute for food and drink. The absence of proper water is part of what makes the house of dust the house of dust. Egypt's field of reeds has the Nile, the most important water in the ancient world, functioning properly, rising and falling in the right season. Greece's underworld has multiple rivers, the Styx, the Lethe, the Mnemosyne, each with a specific function in the geography of the dead. And 1 Enoch 22 has the spring, in the one bright room, luminous. The universality of water in these images is not coincidental. Water is the most basic marker of life. Its presence is the threshold between habitable and uninhabitable in every environment the ancient world knew. To put water in the land of the dead is to say, the dead are not simply absent. They are somewhere where the conditions of presence are maintained, even if in a form different from what the living know. The water says, this is a place, not a void, a place with a feature that marks it as a place where something continues. The Greeks understood this in their particular way. The rivers of the underworld are not just water. Each one does something specific to the dead who encounter it. The Lethe makes you forget your previous life, so that the soul can be reborn. The Mnemosyne, the lake of memory, preserves the knowledge of who you were if you drink from it, so that you do not dissolve into the anonymous mass of the reborn. The choice of which spring to drink from is, on the Orphic tablets, a choice between oblivion and continuation, between the soul that is recycled into a new life without its history, and the soul that carries its history forward into whatever comes next. The Orphic lamellae, the gold tablets, of which the Petilia leaf is one of the oldest and most complete, were found across a remarkably wide geographic range for such small objects. From Crete to the heel of Italy, from Greece to Thessaly, scattered across the ancient Mediterranean world over a span of perhaps 500 years. The people buried with them were not all from the same social class, not all from the same city, not all members of the same specific religious community. They were people who believed, or whose families believed, that the instructions would be useful, that the dead would arrive at a place where there were springs and guardians and the need for a password, and that having the right words would matter. The declaration on the Petilia tablet, "I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is of heaven," is a password with a specific theological claim embedded in it. It asserts a dual origin, earthly and heavenly. It claims the heavenly lineage as the dominant one, the one that grants access, the one that the guardians at the spring of memory need to hear. The dead person is not simply a human being who has died. They are a being of heavenly origin who passed through the earthly, who has returned from the transit through matter and is now reclaiming their prior identity. This is Orphic theology in compressed form, and it has parallels in the Enochic tradition. The Watchers who descended were beings of heavenly origin who entered the earthly. The beings Enoch encountered on his journeys were divine beings who moved between the registers of existence. The bright chamber of the mountain is for spirits whose heavenly account balances, who, when the accounting comes, are found to be the kind of beings who belong in the lit room. The Orphic dead, standing at the spring of memory, are making exactly this claim. I am one of those. My race is of heaven. Let me drink. Nicolsburg is careful. He attributes, he notes the connection. He does not assert that the parable was written as a direct commentary on the Enoch text. But the map behind the parable is recognizable. And the parable, told by one of the most influential teachers in Western history, carried that map into the tradition's memory long after most people had forgotten where the map originally came from. Every neighbor drew a waiting room, but only one text let its traveler walk all the way in, stand in the dark, and describe the rooms one at a time. It's late enough now. Let's go back inside the mountain. And this time, we don't stop at the doorway. The mountain at the western edge of the world is very still. This is not the stillness of emptiness. It is the stillness of something that is full of the accumulated presence of every person who has died since the first person died, held in their sorted spaces, waiting for a day that has not arrived. The mountain is not silent because nothing is here. It is still because everything that is here has long since finished speaking about its passage, finished its last breath and its last movement and its last word, and settled into the particular quality of presence that the living cannot quite achieve, because the living are always still becoming something. The dead in this mountain have arrived. Let's go through each room. The bright chamber is first, and it is the one the text gives most attention to, perhaps because its quality is the most surprising, the most in need of description. You expect the land of the dead to be entirely dark. The text refuses that expectation. One of the 4 rooms is lit. One of them has a spring of luminous water in it, not a dark trickle from underground rock, not a pool of stagnant stillness, but water that carries its own quality of light, that shines in the hollow place the way the moon shines when there are no clouds. The text says the spirits gathered here are the righteous, the ones whose account, when the books are examined on the great day, will show a life that was not perfect. The text makes no claim of perfection, but a life that was, in its essential alignment, directed toward the right. They rest here. The text's word is notable, not rewarded, not celebrated, not elevated, rested. As if the first need of the dead, the need that underlies all others, is simply to stop, to put down whatever they were carrying, to be somewhere that does not demand the next thing, the sound of water in a mountain of silence. Your body is already at rest, or close to it. Let the bright chamber be what it is. You don't need to hold anything here. There is a spring, and it is lit, and the people who have arrived in this room are no longer hurrying. The second chamber is darker, and its inhabitants are held differently. These are the ones who died without having answered for the harm they caused. Not the great criminals, those seem to have their own accounting, but the ordinary wicked, people who lived in a way that damaged the world around them, who profited from others' diminishment, who were never called to account in the ordinary span of their lives. They died with their damage intact. The scales were never formally consulted, and so they wait here, in the dark, in the held breath, not being punished yet, but not resting either. The text gives this room a specific quality, grief. Not the grief of the righteous in the bright chamber, who seem at peace with what they wait for. A different kind of grief. The grief of an account that has not been settled, of a case that is still open on the wrong side of the ledger. The second chamber is where the unresolved go, where the damage that was never addressed in life continues, somehow, to be present, to be held in the room like a weight that nothing has yet lifted. It is the room of held breath, of something not quite finished. Now the third chamber, and this is where the ledger we've been carrying all night comes due. The third chamber holds those who were slain, specifically the wronged, the victims, the ones who died by violence or by injustice, whose lives were cut short by what someone else chose to do. And at the front of this room, giving it its voice, is the spirit that Enoch heard when he first arrived in the mountain. Abel, the first human being ever to die, the first victim, the original unanswered wrong, the complaint that has been on file since before any written system existed to hold it. Abel's spirit makes its petition in the third chamber. The text says, "It pleads, It accuses, it names Cain, it presses its case forward without stopping. And here is what the text understands about this room that most afterlife traditions do not make room for. The dead need to be heard. Not necessarily avenged, not necessarily satisfied, heard. The third chamber is the place where the wronged dead have their own space, not mixed in with everyone else, not lumped into the undifferentiated dark of Sheol, but given a room of their own, a room where their complaint is a legitimate thing to have, where the ledger stays open not as a failure of the system but as a feature of it, because to close the books on Abel before the full accounting is done would be to wrong him again. The oldest open case in existence is still on file, and the mountain keeps it. There is something about this room that I want to give you time with, at this hour, in the particular quality of attention that comes very late at night. The text was written by people who had experienced injustice. The tradition it belongs to had been conquered, deported, occupied, and persecuted. The people who wrote and read the Book of Enoch were often people whose grievances were real, whose suffering had gone without answer, whose losses were enormous and uncompensated. For them, the third chamber was not an abstract theological claim. It was a statement about the structure of reality. The wronged have a room. The complaint is not dismissed. Whatever the great day brings, it will include an accounting for what was done to Abel, and by extension, to everyone whose case resembles his. The books stay open because the wrong has not been corrected, and the text insists with a calm that is almost more affecting than anger would be, that corrected will be, in time, when the day arrives. Now the fourth chamber, at half speed, because what it contains is unlike anything else in the text, and I meant what I said when I planted it 2 hours ago. It needs the right kind of darkness around it. The fourth chamber holds a category of the dead that no other ancient afterlife tradition describes. Not the righteous, not the unrighteous waiting for judgment, not the victims with their open cases, something else entirely, something that the tradition after 1 Enoch mostly chose to forget, to quietly drop from the model as the system simplified and the binary took hold. The text says, "These are the ones who were not slain in the days of the sinners." They did not cry out, the text says. Their spirits will not be punished here, but, and here is the sentence that has been sitting in this text for 2,000 years, waiting for someone to sit with it long enough to feel its weight. Nor shall they be raised from there. Not punished. Not raised. Not reward. Not punishment. A filing decision. These spirits will simply be held, kept. They received their portion in their lives. The text's word is measure, or portion, and the accounting apparently balances. There is nothing more to add on either side, and so they stay. Not in torment, not in bliss, in the fourth chamber of the mountain at the edge of the world, in the dark, in a category that the text names and then declines to mourn, or celebrate, or resolve. It is the most quietly devastating line in the book. The whole subsequent tradition quietly dropped this category. Heaven and hell do not have a fourth option. The binary that most of us inherited, the system that eventually produced the great afterlife traditions of Christianity and Islam, has no room for the neither punished nor raised. They were too complicated, or too troubling, or simply too specific to the particular justice problem that 1 Enoch 22 was trying to solve. The fourth chamber was sealed, the concept was set aside. But in the text, it is still there. In the mountain of hard rock, in the fourth hollow space, in the dark, the ones who received their measure. Neither more nor less, just held. Take a breath. The mountain is administrative in a way that almost no other afterlife text is. There are no flames here. The text does not install flames until later traditions add them. There is no judge on a visible throne. The accounting is deferred, not absent. There is no music in the dark chambers, no celebration in the bright one. Just the spring and the sound of it, and the accumulated presence of the gathered dead, and the patience of a place that has been built for a very long duration of waiting. I want to stay in the bright chamber for a while before we move through the others, because the text's restraint about it is itself informative. The text does not describe what the spirits in the bright chamber are doing. It does not say they are singing, or praising, or engaged in any activity at all. It says their spirits are here, in this bright hollow place, with the spring of luminous water, waiting. What they're waiting for is the great day, and what the great day will produce for them, the text implies but does not specify, is something better than waiting, something the waiting is in service of. This restraint is the text's most sophisticated move. It refuses to describe the bright chamber as paradise. That word comes later, from outside this text. It refuses to describe it as reward. It describes it as rest, the cessation of something that was demanding and will eventually be fully resolved. The bright chamber is not the destination. It is the last stop before the destination, and the last stop is made as comfortable as the tradition can make it. Light and water, and silence that is chosen rather than imposed. Compare this to Sheol's silence, which is the silence of no activity, no memory, no relationship. The bright chamber's silence is different in kind. It is the silence of something being held, the way a letter is held in an envelope before it is opened, intact and present and complete but not yet delivered. The spirits here are not diminished, they are pending. The quality of the spring's water, luminous, is the one sensory detail the text provides, and it carries significant weight because it is the only literal light source in the entire mountain. The mountain's bright chamber is not bright because of a window, not bright because of fire or lamp. It is bright because of the spring. The water generates the light. The life source and the light source are the same thing. This is the image I want you to hold as you move through the other chambers. A spring that makes its own light, in a mountain at the end of the world, for the spirits that rest beside it. The second chamber requires a different quality of attention. These are the ones who died having caused harm that was never answered for, and the text's rendering of their condition is psychologically precise in a way I didn't fully appreciate until I had read the chapter several times. They are not being punished. That is the first thing to understand, and it is counterintuitive. You would expect a chamber for the wicked to involve punishment, fire, cold, the machinery of consequence that later traditions will develop in great detail. The second chamber has none of that. It has dark, and it has what the text calls great suffering. But the suffering is the suffering of the unresolved, not the suffering of the deliberately tortured. The distinction is important. Unresolved suffering is the suffering of something that has not yet been adjudicated. It is the suffering of a case that is still pending, of an account that has not been settled, of a situation that needs a resolution it has not yet received. The wicked in the second chamber are not in the process of being punished. They are in the process of waiting to be accountable, and the waiting, apparently, is not comfortable. The weight of what they did is present with them, in the dark, without the possibility of undoing it or running from it, or distracting themselves from it, with the ordinary business of a living life. There is something about this rendering of the wicked's condition that is more honest and, in its own way, more disturbing than the traditional imagery of hellfire. Fire, in the later tradition, is applied from outside. It happens to the punished. But the second chamber's suffering comes from inside, the weight of what the person was and what they did, held in full awareness, in the dark, without the ordinary human capacity for self-deception or distraction. The dark room with the great suffering is a room where nothing can be hidden from the person who has to inhabit it. That, the text implies, is its own form of consequence. Now the third chamber, and Abel. I said earlier that Abel's presence as the first voice is the text's structural argument about the afterlife, and I want to make that argument explicit before we move on. The third chamber is for the slain, for the wronged, for those whose lives were cut short or diminished by what other people chose to do to them. And Abel is their representative, not because he is the most important person in the chamber, but because he is the oldest, the first case, the founding entry in the ledger. And what he is doing in the dark chamber is not resting, and not suffering, and not waiting in silence. He is pleading. His voice goes up out of the chamber without stopping. He names Cain. He names what was done. He specifies what he wants, not revenge exactly, but justice, the elimination of the consequence of Cain's act, the undoing of what the violence started. The text gives Abel's spirit an active role in its own case. It is not passive. It is not dissolved. It is not resigned to the dark. It presses its case forward with the energy of someone who knows they have a legitimate complaint and has every intention of continuing to make it until it is heard. This is the tradition's answer to the problem of the wronged. Not, the wronged will eventually be comforted, though that is implied for the day that's coming. Not, the wronged should make peace with what happened, which is the instruction of a tradition that has given up on justice. But, the wronged have a room. Their complaint is preserved. Their case is on file. The ledger stays open not because the system has failed, but because the system takes the complaint seriously enough to keep it active. Abel's case has been active for as long as the tradition has remembered that there was a Cain and an Abel. Every telling of the story is another iteration of the complaint. Every time someone tells the older child and the younger child, the offering accepted and the offering refused, the face that fell and the field, and the question, "Where is your brother?" they are keeping Abel's case active. The mountain holds it in a hollow chamber. The tradition holds it in the telling. Both are filing systems for the same complaint. The fourth chamber, half-speed. This is the part of the text that the whole tradition subsequently declined to carry forward, and its absence from what came after tells us something important about what traditions can and cannot sustain. The text is trying to solve a justice problem. If the accounting is moral, what happens to people whose accounting is genuinely ambiguous? Not clearly righteous, not clearly wicked, not victims of obvious injustice, just ordinary. People whose lives were mostly unremarkable, whose ledger shows the ordinary mixture of the human, and who therefore have neither a strong case for the bright room nor a strong case for the dark one. The text's answer, the answer the tradition subsequently dropped, is a fourth category, those who received their portion already. In their lives, they had what they had, the measuring is complete, and so they are held, in the dark, in the fourth chamber, neither punished nor raised. The books balance, the accounting is done, there is simply nothing further to do. Read the sentence again, at the pace it deserves, nor shall they be raised from there. Not raised. The later tradition developed the concept of resurrection, the raising of the dead on the great day, the embodied return that Jewish and Christian and Islamic eschatology agree on in various forms. But the fourth chamber's inhabitants are not raised. They do not participate in the resurrection, they are simply kept, in their balanced condition, without the consequence of punishment and without the promise of the raising. This is the most theologically radical move in the chapter, and it is the one that the tradition, as it developed, could not sustain. A resurrection that is universal, that raises everyone, righteous and wicked alike, to face the final accounting, is a resurrection that cannot simultaneously keep the fourth chamber filed away. If everyone is raised, the fourth chamber is empty. The category of the neither punished nor raised has to be abandoned if resurrection is to be universal. And universal resurrection won. The fourth chamber was sealed. Its inhabitants, if the text is to be believed, are still there, in the dark, in the balance, in the patience of a category that the tradition outgrew. None of this is offered as a description of what lies ahead for any person listening tonight. What the text shows is what a group of people, in a specific century, in a specific situation, believed was true, and why they needed to believe it. The sorting mattered to them because the injustice of unsorted death was intolerable. The bright room mattered because something had to. The fourth chamber mattered because the books had to balance somehow, and the tradition they inherited had no answer for the ones who had already balanced. It is time to come back up into the evening air and say plainly what this text is, what became of its map, and what, honestly, we know. Here is what became of the mountain. Within a century or two of the text we've been following, the four rooms began to simplify. The tradition kept the central problem, the justice problem, the need to sort the dead, the refusal to let Sheol's undifferentiated dark be the final answer, but it streamlined the solution. 2 destinations, not 4. The binary sharpened. The fourth chamber, with its strange category of the neither punished nor raised, vanished from the model. The third chamber's carefully maintained ledger of the wronged compressed into a general expectation of vindication. The second chamber's held cases merged, eventually, into the idea of a place of consequence, what later tradition would call, in Hebrew, Gehenna. And the bright chamber, with its spring of luminous water, became, in time, what the Greek-speaking Jewish tradition called paradise, a word borrowed from Persian, meaning a walled garden, a royal enclosure, a place of protected and cultivated beauty. The comfort of the righteous, held separately from the consequence of the wicked, waiting on different sides of something that the parable of Lazarus would call a great chasm fixed. The waiting survived, the rooms simplified, the fourth one disappeared. There is something worth sitting with in that disappearance. The fourth chamber was the tradition's attempt to solve a very specific problem. What do you do with people who were not particularly good and not particularly wicked, who received their ordinary portion in an ordinary life and have nothing dramatic on either side of the ledger? The binary doesn't have an answer for them. Heaven and hell, as a system, requires everyone to be one thing or the other, requires that the accounting always resolve to one of the two available outcomes. The fourth chamber refused that requirement. It held open the possibility of a third category, people who were simply held, neither more nor less. The tradition's inability to sustain that category tells you something about what the tradition needed from its afterlife. It needed resolution. It needed the books to close. The fourth chamber left them open in the most disconcerting possible way, neither punished nor raised. And that openness was eventually too much for a tradition that was trying to comfort its people with a clear outcome. What it left behind instead was the waiting, in prayers for the dead, in the practice of saying prayers for a period after death, in the hope or the belief that the dead are somewhere between the last breath and the final accounting, that they can be prayed for, that the living and the dead are still in some kind of relationship, that the books are not quite closed yet. This practice exists in Judaism, in Catholicism, in Islam, in forms that differ in their theology and their ritual, but share the structural assumption: the dead are waiting, they are somewhere, and where they are is not the end. The bosom of Abraham, the phrase from the parable of Lazarus, a phrase that became one of the most beloved images in the history of the tradition, is itself a waiting image. Not paradise in the final sense, not the conclusion. The bosom of Abraham, closeness, comfort, the proximity of the founding father, held in warmth while the accounting completes. A waiting room with a name that sounds like coming home. Now the scholarly reckoning, because this journey deserves an honest one. 1 Enoch 22 is a real text. Its content is verifiable. The four chambers, the spring of luminous water, the voice of Abel, the categories of the sorted dead, the fourth chamber's sentence, all of it is in the text, in the manuscripts, in the scholarship. It is not a secret, it is not suppressed. It is available in translation, studied in seminaries and universities, commented on by people who have spent careers with it. What makes it obscure is not that anyone is hiding it. What makes it obscure is that it exists in a tradition most people haven't been introduced to, in a category of texts, the Second Temple Jewish pseudepigrapha, that occupies an awkward middle ground between the Bible and the secular, read by specialists and largely unknown to general readers. The Book of Enoch is not in the Old Testament that most of the world reads. It is not in the New Testament. It is not particularly present in mainstream Jewish practice. It lives in Ethiopia and in scholarship, and in the caves above the Dead Sea where its Aramaic fragments wait. The survival story deserves a note, because this is the third time we've been in this book together. The version most of the world reads comes from the Ethiopic canon, a complete Ge'ez translation preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which incorporated the Book of Enoch as scripture and kept it whole, while the rest of the tradition lost its grip on it. The Aramaic original, from which the book was almost certainly translated, the text that was circulating in Judea in the first centuries, the text that the community at Qumran kept in their library, survives in fragments, perhaps 20% of the original. 4/5 of what the earliest readers read is still missing, still in the ground somewhere, or destroyed, or simply gone in the ordinary way that most of what people write eventually disappears. The book that sorted the dead was itself nearly lost, and waited, in the dark, in the caves above the Dead Sea, for almost 2,000 years, to be found. The irony of that is the kind that the book itself might have appreciated. Where do the dead wait then? Here is the text's answer, assembled honestly. Close, west, inside a great mountain of hard rock, at the far end of the world, past the mouths of all the rivers. 3 hollow places that are dark, and one that is bright, with a spring of luminous water in the bright one. Everyone gathered here, all of them, without exception, held in their sorted categories, until a day the text calls great, a day that has not come. Abel's complaint still on file in the 3rd chamber. The 4th chamber holding its strange category of the simply held, in a darkness that is neither punishment nor rescue. The bright chamber's spring running with its self-generated light for the ones who rest there. And the historical answer, underneath the text's answer, assembled with the same honesty. This is the room where heaven and hell were being invented. This is the text where the Jewish tradition first thought to draw rooms in the afterlife, first solved the justice problem of Sheol by sorting it, first gave the wronged their own space, first imagined the waiting period as an architecture rather than an absence. What came after it, the binary that most of the world inherited, was simpler, more portable, more ready for the moral clarity that a tradition under pressure needs its afterlife to provide. But for one strange period, before the rooms resolved into the binary, before the 4th chamber was dropped from the ledger, before the great chasm was fixed, for 1 century or 2, perhaps, in the intellectual ferment of Second Temple Judaism, the map had 4 rooms. The accounting was not closed, the books were held open, and the only light in the whole building came from a spring of water in the room where the righteous rested. Let me say something honest about the limitations of the text before we try to say what it means. The Book of Enoch is an ancient Jewish religious text. It is not archaeology. It is not a scientific account of what happens after death. It is not suppressed truth that mainstream religion has hidden from you. It is a product of its time and place and community, a product of a specific set of pressures, a specific set of questions, a specific set of cultural resources that were available to the people who wrote it. The scholars who study it treat it with the same rigor and the same respect they apply to any ancient document. They try to understand what it meant to the people who wrote it, what sources it drew on, what problems it was trying to solve, and what it tells us about the intellectual and spiritual world of Second Temple Judaism. They do not, by and large, read it as a literal report from someone who has visited the mountain and come back with measurements. But they take it seriously, because it is a serious document, because the people who wrote it were serious people, doing serious intellectual work on a serious question. And because what it did to the tradition that received it was real and lasting, it installed the rooms, it made the sorting stick, it gave the wronged a chamber of their own in the infrastructure of what comes next. And those installations did not disappear when the text simplified. They survived in altered form, passed through Luke 16's parable, through the medieval tradition of purgatory, through the Islamic barzakh, the interval between death and the final judgment, through the Jewish practice of morning prayers for the dead. The concept that persisted in all these forms is the concept of a period, an interval, a time between the last breath and the final accounting that is neither immediate reward nor immediate punishment, but something in between, a held space, a waiting room, a condition of being present but pending. The specific architecture of 1 Enoch 22 was largely lost or transformed. The concept it installed was not. In Catholic tradition, purgatory is a place of purification, of finishing the work of becoming what the person was always meant to be, with the pain not of punishment, but of purification. Its geography is not the mountain in the west. Its logic is not the sorted chambers, but its structural position, between death and final judgment, a period during which prayer for the dead can make a difference, is recognizable as a version of the same problem the mountain was solving. In Jewish tradition, the Kaddish, the morning prayer said for 11 months after a death, is based on a concept that the dead are in a process during that period, a process that can be supported or helped by the prayers and merit of the living. The mechanics differ entirely from 1 Enoch 22's architecture. The underlying assumption that the dead are somewhere accessible to the relationship between the living and the dead is similar. In Islamic tradition, the barzakh is the realm of the dead between individual death and the day of judgment, a waiting period, explicitly named as an interval. The word itself means a barrier or partition. The dead are partitioned from the living, and from the final accounting, by this space, held there until the day is ready for them. 3 traditions, 3 different architectures, the same structural slot. Between the last breath and whatever comes next, there is a period of waiting. The mountain did not survive, but the waiting did. The survival of the text itself is a small story inside the larger story, and it deserves a note. The Book of Enoch in its complete form is canonical in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the Tewahedo Church, which incorporated it into its Bible and has read it as scripture for most of 2,000 years. The Ethiopic version, preserved in the Ge'ez language, is what allowed scholars to reconstruct the text in full. Without Ethiopia, the book would be known only from fragments and quotations. The Aramaic fragments from Qumran, recovered beginning in 1947 from the caves above the Dead Sea, are probably around 20% of the original text. The book that sorted the dead was itself nearly sorted into the category of the permanently lost. It waited, in the dark, in the caves, in one country, to be found. And then it was found, by accident, by a Bedouin shepherd throwing a stone into a cave, by the particular contingency of where a community chose to keep its library 2,000 years ago. That the text describing the chambers of the waiting dead was itself waiting, in the dark, to be retrieved. That the description of the patient holding place was itself patiently held, is the kind of irony the book might have appreciated. It is, at minimum, the kind of irony that rewards sitting with at this hour, in the particular quality of attention that the very late night produces. The texts that survive are the ones that mattered enough to someone to copy, and the ones that are still being read across the span of human history are the ones that touched something persistent in the human experience, something that did not change with the millennium or the century or the culture, because the question it addresses does not change. There is a version of the story where the mountain doesn't matter at all, where what 1 Enoch 22 shows us is purely a product of its time, a theological workaround for a justice problem, a Second Temple text solving the intellectual crisis of Maccabean-era Judaism, interesting historically and not particularly relevant to anything beyond the discipline of ancient religious studies. That version is not wrong. What it is incomplete, not because it fails to account for the text, but because it fails to account for the 4,000 years of the text's inheritance. The mountain may be a theological construct. The waiting room concept it installed is not. Every generation since has had its version of the interval. Every tradition that cares about what happens after the last breath has made room for a period between death and whatever comes next. A period that is neither fully concluded nor fully begun, in which the dead are somewhere that prayer can reach, or love can hold, or the accounting can proceed. The mountain of hard rock was one description of that period. The bosom of Abraham was another. The Barzakh was another. Purgatory was another. The 11 months of the Kaddish was another. They are different architectures for the same structural slot. Between the last breath and the final accounting, something happens. Something is held. The books stay open. The West keeps its counsel. And this, perhaps, is what remains true either way, regardless of what the mountain is, regardless of whether the spring is literally luminous, regardless of what the great day will look like when it arrives. Real people made real gold leaves with real instructions. Real scribes wrote down 4 real rooms in a real mountain. Real families buried their dead with coins for a real ferryman. Real communities prayed for their dead, in the real belief that the dead were somewhere and the prayers could reach them. The care is real, the refusal to say gone is real. And 4,000 years of that refusal is not a mistake. It is the most consistent thing human beings have ever done. Where do the dead wait? The question is 4,000 years old. The answers are various. The question remains. Whatever else these texts are, whatever your relationship to the tradition they come from, whatever you believe or don't believe about what comes after the last breath, they are 4,000 years of refusing to say gone. Real people folded gold instructions into real graves because they believed the dead would need to know which spring not to drink from. Real scribes wrote down the categories of the mountain because they needed the wronged to have a room of their own. Real communities prayed for the dead because the dead were somewhere, and somewhere is not gone. The question tonight was, where do the dead wait? The text's answer is the mountain. The tradition's answer is wherever the waiting takes them. And the human answer, which may be the most durable of all, is not far, not gone. Close enough that the books are still open, the spring is still running, and the West is still the direction everything eventually goes. You do this every night. You lie down, you close your eyes, you hand the day over, not to anyone in particular, not to a decision you've made, but to the night, to the dark, to the particular quality of this hour that is different from every other hour. And then you wait. You wait in the dark for something you cannot hurry. Sleep does not come when you call it. It comes when it comes, when your body has done whatever it needs to do at the edge of consciousness, when your mind has loosened its grip on the day's unfinished business, enough to let go, when the transition happens by itself, the way all transitions eventually do. You cannot force it. You can only arrange the conditions and be patient. The people who drew the waiting rooms understood this. Not because they were thinking about sleep, they were thinking about death. But the two are close enough, structurally, that the ancient world noticed the resemblance. Hypnos and Thanatos, sleep and death, were brothers in the Greek tradition, twins, the children of the same night. The Romans called them the twin sons of night, and called them brothers of oblivion. The one was gentle and knightly and reversible, the other was final. But they shared a mother and a quality, the quality of letting go, and the ancient world, which was not sentimental about death but was very attentive to its details, saw the family resemblance. Every night you rehearse the smaller version. You close your eyes in a dark room. You trust that something, morning, light, the continuation of everything, is on the other side of the dark. You wait, in the particular stillness that your body has learned to settle into over a whole life of nights, for something you have no way to make happen faster. The ancients would have recognized your evening perfectly. They would have recognized the room, the hour, the posture, the particular letting go of the day's accumulated weight. They might have added something you don't add, a coin under the tongue, a folded leaf of gold with instructions, a prayer for the waiting, but the evening itself, the lying down, the dark, the trust that the morning is there even when you can't see it, that is the same evening they had. You are in the same dark. And if the text is right, if the mountain is there, if the spring is running, if the rooms hold what they hold until the great day, then what you're doing right now, in the small version, is the oldest human practice there is. Waiting in a dark room, believing in a lit one, trusting the accounting to something larger and slower and more patient than you. The spring is running. It has been running since before anyone thought to write it down. Before you go further into the night, a very small ask. If this kind of evening is what you come here for, the slow ones, the ones that go all the way west without hurrying, a quiet tap-on like helps other quiet ones find their way here. Leave a comment below. Where in the world are you tonight? And what did you see the last time you watched the sun go down? I'll read every one of them. And if this is the kind of company you want to keep on these long nights, there's a subscribe button, completely optional, and watching and listening and resting here is already more than enough. If you want to come along on the whole journey, all the texts, all the maps, all the waiting rooms, the membership link is there too. But none of it is required. You've already done the hard part. You stayed until the end of the west. Now, the sun that was going down somewhere west of you at the beginning of tonight has gone all the way west now, past your horizon, past whoever else was watching it from wherever they were, past the coastlines and the ocean and the places where the rivers meet the sea, past the boundary where the text says the mountain stands, if the mountain is there, at the far end of everything, past the mouths of all the rivers, where the world runs out of road. The gold leaf lies quiet in its glass case in London. The British Museum is closed. The lights are off in the galleries. The small piece of gold, 4.5 centimetres, thin as a breath, with its instructions scratched in letters smaller than your smallest fingernail, rests in its case in the dark, the way it rested in the ground for 23 centuries before someone found it. It has been waiting longer than almost anything else in this night's story. It knows how to wait. And inside the mountain, if the mountain is there, in the hollow places that are deep and wide and smooth, the spring is running in the bright room. It has been running since the first person who needed it arrived. It will be running until the day the text calls great, whenever that is, whatever it means, however the accounting finally closes. There is something specifically calibrated about the hour you're in right now that makes this topic available in a way it isn't during the day. During the day, the dead are an abstraction. The business of being alive is too present, too demanding, too full of the next thing, to allow the question of what comes after the last breath to arrive with any real weight. You can think about it in the way you think about any topic that is adjacent to you but not quite in contact, at a comfortable remove, as an intellectual exercise, as something to form an opinion about. But at this hour, at the edge of sleep, the question becomes something different. The distance collapses a little. The things that matter during the day have loosened their grip. The to-do list, the unanswered messages, the plans and the schedules and the continuous low-grade maintenance of a living life. And in that loosened space, the question arrives with a different quality, not as something to form an opinion about, but as something to feel the weight of. You are going to sleep soon. You are going to lose consciousness in a way that will feel, while it is happening, like nothing. And then you will wake, and the night will have been whatever it was. The part of you that is awake and aware will not experience the sleeping hours. It will simply be absent and then present again. And every night you do this, you practice a small version of the act the texts are all trying to describe. The setting aside of the daily self, the letting go of the accumulated weight of being awake, the trust that something continues on the other side of the dark. The ancients, who thought more directly about death than the modern world typically does, understood this continuity between sleep and death as a real thing, not as a metaphor, but as a structural similarity that could tell you something true. Hypnos is the brother of Thanatos not because the Greeks were being fanciful, but because the Greeks were being observant. Sleep is the practice run for death, and death is the sleep that does not come with a guaranteed waking. But what the texts tonight have been insisting, in their different ways, from their different angles, in their different languages and traditions and centuries, is that the waking comes, not from the person themselves, not through any capacity of their own, but through whatever the great day is, whatever the accounting is, whatever the spring in the bright room is preparing its inhabitants for. The mountain holds the gathered dead in its hollow places not because it intends to hold them forever. It holds them until. The until is the important word. Until the day that will complete the accounting. Until the case of Abel is adjudicated and the books are closed. Until the spring in the bright room has served its purpose and something opens. You are being held tonight in the ordinary way, by sleep. The mattress, the pillow, the room, and the dark and the particular acoustic texture of whatever night sounds exist where you are. You are held in the waiting of the small hours, held between the last hour of the day and the first hour of tomorrow. And when you wake, you will be on the other side of the dark, and the world will be approximately the way you left it, and the question of where the dead wait will wait until another night. The spring is running. That is the image I want to leave you with. Not the dark chambers, not the complaint of Abel, not the strange sentence about the fourth room, but the spring. The luminous spring in the bright hollow place, in the mountain of hard rock, at the far end of the west, running without being filled, running without draining, running in the one room in the whole building where the lights are on. The gold leaf in its case in London knows about that spring. The Petilia tablet, with its instructions about which spring not to drink from and which spring to drink from, was written by someone who knew, or believed they knew, that water exists there, in some form, at the boundary of the world. They felt it necessary to instruct the dead about the water. They folded the instructions into gold. They placed the gold in the grave. Someone cared that much about what happens next. Someone took the time and the gold and the careful engraving of Greek letters, smaller than your smallest fingernail, to make sure the dead person would know what to say when they arrived at the spring. That care is not nothing. Whatever you believe the spring corresponds to, whatever the spring is, in whatever reality beyond the last breath it may or may not exist, the care that went into the instructions is completely, verifiably, inarguably real. A real person engraved it. A real family buried it. 4,000 years of human beings have been trying to get this right for someone they loved. The mountain is still there tonight, if the text is right. The hollow places are as they were, deep, wide, very smooth, and the spring in the bright room is running with the same quality of luminous water it has always had. The complaint from the third chamber is still being pressed by the spirit that the text tells us is Abel, with the patience of something that has been waiting since the beginning of human history for an answer that is still coming. The fourth chamber holds its balanced inhabitants in the quiet of a category the tradition afterward declined to preserve. And the gold leaf, which was already old when Rome was young, lies in its case with the words still legible in the gold, still telling the dead to go right, not left, still telling them what to say to the guardians, still insisting that the spring of memory exists, that it has guardians, that it responds to the right password. The instructions have not expired. The leaf is still working. It has been working for 2,300 years in a glass case in London, and before that for 2,300 years in the ground of southern Italy, and before that it was new, and before that the words on it were being carefully scratched by someone who believed they mattered enough to put on gold. Abel can rest his case until morning. The chambers can keep their own counsel until morning. The West has done its work and can wait until morning. The world, with everything it carries, everything it asks, everything that was unfinished when you lay down tonight, the world can wait until morning. For now, you can rest.